Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to the next instalment in my guide to Victorian authors. If you don't know what this series is, I will link down below the introduction to the series and the first couple of videos in the series, but today we're going to be talking about Victorian authors from Amy Dillwyn to Elizabeth Gaskell. So let's start off with a real favourite Victorian author of mine, Amy Dillwyn. Amy Dillwyn was born in 1845 and died in 1935, and she was a fascinating person. So she was a Welsh novelist and industrialist, and she was the kind of person who always liked to subvert expectations. She turned up to her father's funeral with a purple skirt and flowers in her hat. She often preferred to wear more traditionally masculine clothing, and she liked to smoke cigars, which was very unusual for a woman at the time. After the death of her father and brother, she took over the family factory, the Spelter Works, and ran it herself, and was responsible for a workforce of 300 people. She considered herself a man of business, and she was a feminist campaigner, giving money to the Women's Freedom League, and later becoming president of Swansea's branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. As I have said in other videos in this Guide to Victorian Author series, it can be very hard to, assign a sexuality to someone from the past, and when we can't see inside their head or understand how they would have understood their own sexuality. But I think it is fair to say broadly that Amy Dillwyn was queer in some way. We know that she was engaged to a man, but after his death, she formed a very close friendship with a woman called Olive Talbot. She sometimes in her diaries and letters referred to Olive as her wife, but in other places it sounds like the relationship was kind of unrequited, mostly the love being on Amy's side, so it's a bit hard to tell. One very interesting sentence she once wrote in her diary was, "My own belief is that I'm half a man, and the male half of my nature fell in love with her years ago and can't fall out of it again. I care for her romantically, passionately, foolishly, and try as I may, I cannot get over it," which is obviously really fascinating, both in terms of Amy Dillwyn's sort of gender identity as well as her sexuality. And she is just a really, really interesting figure, and she wrote fantastic novels. Within her novels, she often subverts gender expectations and gender roles, and she does explore same-sex desire in a really interesting way. So I've read 3 of her books and loved all of them. So there's The Rebecca Rioter from 1880, there's A Burglary from 1883, and there is Jill from 1884. My favourite is Jill, and Jill is the most subversive. It is about a upper-class young woman who runs away from home because she's bored, decides to become a servant, and is very much in unrequited love with the woman that she works for. And Jill is just like everything a Victorian woman wasn't supposed to be, and it's awesome. So I really recommend Jill, but I do recommend all her books. I feel like you could start with any of those 3, but I feel like A Burglary is in a way the slightly more conventional Victorian novel, so maybe that's the more accessible one to start with. But to be honest, I think they're all great and you could start with any of them. Amy Dillwyn wrote 4 other novels that I have yet to read and that I definitely want to read at some point. As I said, she is an absolute favourite of mine and I really want to read her work. I think probably top of my list, but also I'm slightly wary of, is her novel Jack and Jill, which is a sequel to Jill, and that came out in 1887, and I love Jill as a novel so much that I'm slightly concerned about the sequel, but I am curious and I do love Amy Dillwyn, so yes, at some point I will read everything she ever wrote. The next author I want to mention is Benjamin Disraeli. He was born in 1804 and died in 1881, and he was a novelist and politician from London. He was an MP from 1837 and was Prime Minister twice, very briefly in 1868, and then for 6 years in the 1870s. Disraeli was Jewish but converted to Christianity when he was a child. I think he's about 12 years old when his father fell out with the synagogue and decided that his family were going to convert to Christianity. Disraeli is best known for his work in politics. He was part of the Conservative Party and is sort of known for his One Nation conservatism and for his long-term rivalry with the Liberal politician William Gladstone, who was also Prime Minister several times, and they kind of alternated a little bit. Later on in his life, Disraeli was made the Earl of Beaconsfield, so you would have called him Lord Beaconsfield, but he is best known as Benjamin Disraeli. His political career is really, really interesting. I actually studied Gladstone and Disraeli and their politics when I was in sort of 6th form at school. So sort of when I was 16, 17 years old, we did a big kind of module all about them, which was fascinating. And I read quite a lot of books about them. But I feel like I don't have time to go into his political career today. So instead, let me talk about his writing career. He was a writer throughout his political career. His first novel was published in 1826, and then he published 17 novels throughout his career, obviously starting before the Victorian period and going through the Victorian period. He also wrote some non-fiction, one play, and some poetry, but he's sort of best known for his social critique novels, especially for the two novels Coningsby and Sybil. The only book by him that I have read is Sybil or the Two Nations from 1845, and I read that a long time ago. I really enjoyed it when I read it. I don't remember it very well. I would like to read more by him at some point in the future. Sybil looks interestingly at poverty and kind of class division. The two nations of the title are like the upper classes and the lower classes, basically. So I would like to read Coningsby next. That's from 1844 and is his kind of most well-known novel. But in general, I would just like to read more by Disraeli because I think he's a very interesting historical figure as well as an interesting novelist. The next author I want to mention is Gertrude Dix. She was born in 1867 and died in 1950. That must have been a fascinating life. Sometimes I look at the lifetimes of late Victorian authors and think wow, what a change you must have seen if you were born in 1867 and died in 1950. Dix was from London, but spent a lot of her life in Bristol. She was a really interesting figure, another kind of early feminist writer, sort of part of the New Woman movement, and kind of involved both in socialism and in feminism. I haven't yet read anything by her, but I really want to. So I'm keen to read her novel, The Girl from the Farm from 1895, which is about a friendship between a middle-class woman and a working-class woman. And I'm also interested to read The Image Breakers from 1900, which apparently is like a socialist takedown of the New Woman movement, kind of critiquing the New Woman movement and the problems within it from a socialist perspective. So that sounds fascinating and definitely needs to go on my list. Talking of the New Woman movement though, the next author I want to speak about is Lady Florence Dixie. She was a Scottish writer born in 1855 and she died in 1905. And she wrote fiction both for adults and for children, as well as writing some non-fiction travel writing. She was also a journalist and worked as a war correspondent during the First Boer War, which is really interesting. And she also played a key role in establishing Women's Association football. What a fascinating woman. She actually kind of became best known for one of her non-fiction travel writing books, Across Patagonia from 1880. But the book by her that I have read and absolutely loved is Gloriana or the Revolution of 1900 from 1890. Gloriana is a novel about a feminist revolution, and thematically it is this amazing, super radical feminist novel, but plot-wise it's a sensation novel with so much drama and betrayal, and it's just absolutely amazing. Like, it is both like so empowering and also such a good time. I cannot recommend Gloriana enough. I thought it was amazing. So I am really excited to read more by Florence Dixie. I'd be quite interested to read some of her children's books, such as Anouilh or the Warrior Queen from 1890. I think that'd be quite interesting. And I also want to read Isola or the Disinherited, A Revolt for Women and All the Disinherited from 1902, just outside of the Victorian period, but I do really want to read it. She is a great writer and I'm really keen to read more by her. Another fantastic late Victorian feminist writer would be Ella Hepworth Dixon. She was born in 1857 and died in 1932, and she also sometimes wrote under the pen name Margaret Winman. Ella Hepworth Dixon is a really interesting. She was an author and editor from London, and her father worked as an editor before her, so she kind of knew a lot of literary figures from an early age. Geraldine Dewsbury was a family friend who we'll be talking about tomorrow, I think. And she also knew Edward Bulwer Lytton, who we spoke about yesterday, I guess. And later on in life, she worked as an editor of the magazine The Woman's World alongside Oscar Wilde. So, you know, she knew everybody. And she was a really interesting sort of feminist and proto-feminist writer, part of the New Woman movement again. Her sister Marion also wrote some short fiction, including a really wonderful short story called A Thief in the Night that I loved. I'm not including Marion properly because she only wrote like a handful of short stories, but I thought I would briefly mention her in Ella's section. Ella Hepworth Dixon is a great writer, as I said. She published 2 novels during the Victorian period and then a few works after the Victorian period, so I have read the 2 things that she published during the Victorian period, both of which I loved. So there is My Flirtations from 1892, which is a short, delightful, episodic, super accessible Victorian work in which basically the narrator recounts the tales of 13 men who she flirted with, and it's just very, very fun. And then I also really liked her novel, The Story of a Modern Woman from 1894, about a young woman trying to support herself independently, first as an artist and then as a writer. I would say that My Flirtations is a much more fun novel, so in that sense it's potentially the place to start with Ella Hepworth Dixon. But if you're more interested in the kind of new woman, early feminist movements, then The Story of a Modern Woman is probably more interesting. Although within My Flirtations, the narrator's sister is definitely more of a new woman figure and is just like there in the background judging all her flirtations, wondering why she wants to be bothered about marriage anyway. It's so fun. Anyway, as I said, I've read all of Dixon's Victorian novels, but there are a couple of books by her from the 20th century that I'm quite interested to read, probably especially her autobiographical book, As I Knew Them from 1930. I feel like that would be really fascinating because, as I said, she had a really, really interesting life and knew everybody. The next author I want to talk about is Arthur Conan Doyle. I am categorising him under Doyle rather than Conan because Doyle was legally his surname, Conan was a middle name, but we do often call him Conan Doyle, don't we, rather than Doyle, so you know, anyway, he's staying here. He was born in Edinburgh, but later settled in London, and he was a practicing doctor for some of his life, as well as a writer. And he was always a big supporter of and campaigner for vaccination. As a writer, Conan Doyle was hugely prolific, and although he is best known for his Sherlock Holmes stories today, he wrote a lot of other things, including adventure stories, historical fiction, some other mysteries. His career spanned the late Victorian period and the early 20th century, and I think he wrote more than 20 novels and more than 200 short stories, as well as some non-fiction and some plays. He was also a Freemason and very interested in spiritualism, believing in seances and fairies and various other things like that. As I said, he is definitely best known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, which would be a great sadness to Doyle himself. In fact, he once said, "If in 100 years I am only known as the man who invented Sherlock Holmes, then I will have considered my life a failure." And alas, poor Conan Doyle, I fear he is only known as the man who invented Sherlock Holmes. So I have read several things by Conan Doyle, some from the Victorian period, some from afterwards. So I've read all of the Sherlock Holmes books, A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Those are the four from the Victorian period. And then from the early 20th century, The Hound of the Baskervilles, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, The Valley of Fear, and His Last Bow. I've read all of them. I really like the Sherlock Holmes stories, especially the short stories more than the novels, although The Hound of the Baskervilles is pretty great. And then I've also read a couple of non-Sherlock Holmes things. So I've read The Lost World, which is early 20th century work, and The Mystery of Clumber, which is one of his other mystery novels from the 1880s, which I didn't especially love. But I have got a lot more Conan Doyle to read. I'm hoping to read The White Company from 1891, which is a work of historical fiction set in the 100 Years' War. I'm hoping to read that very soon. And in general, I'd like to read a few works of his historical fiction just to see whether or not he was mistaken in believing that his other books were stronger than Sherlock Holmes. I just think Sherlock Holmes is a wonderful character, and I just think the Sherlock Holmes mysteries and the kind of way the detective figure is built up through Sherlock Holmes and just the influence he had on like the detective as a literary figure is just so huge and so important. And I think it's a shame that Conan Doyle didn't love Sherlock Holmes as the public did and do. The next author I want to talk about is George du Maurier. He was born in 1834 and died in 1896. He was actually born in France, but he later settled in London and spent most of his life in England. And if his surname sounds familiar, then yes, he was indeed the grandfather of Daphne du Maurier. He worked as a cartoonist and an illustration for magazines, and in fact he illustrated Charles Warren Adams's novel, The Notting Hill Mystery, which we spoke about a couple of days ago. He later went on to become a writer, and he published 3 novels during the Victorian period. I have read one of them, Trilby from 1894, which I didn't love. It's where the term Trilby hat comes from, which is kind of a fun piece of trivia. And it is about a group of artists and an artist model named Trilby. It was very, very successful at the time, and apparently also had a big influence on the Phantom of the Opera. Like apparently apparently the Phantom of the Opera was inspired by Trilby. There's a plot thread in it where the artist model kind of becomes a singer. It didn't hugely gel with the writing style, and it is a very, very anti-Semitic novel. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in Victorian literature. You will find it in a lot of novels in the background, but it is very much in the foreground in Trilby, and that makes it quite an uncomfortable read, I would say. I wouldn't really recommend Trilby, and I'm not sure how keen I am to carry on reading anything more by George du Maurier, although I am kind of interested to try his 1897 novel The Martian, which was published posthumously after he died, and it's apparently about someone who has like an artistic muse who visits them in their dreams, who is a female spirit from Mars, and that sounds so totally wacky that I kind of want to give it a try. The next author I want to mention is Emily Eden. She was born in 1797 and died in 1869. She was a poet, a novelist, an artist, and a diarist. She was from London, but she also spent several years living in India in the 1830s and 40s, and she wrote an account of her travels in India, which sold very well at the time. She also wrote 2 novels, both of which I have read. So there is The Semi-Detached House, which was published in 1859 and we think was written, in the 1850s. And then there was also The Semi-Attached Couple, which was published in 1860, but we think she probably actually wrote it in the 1820s, like quite a long time before it was published. I enjoyed both of these novels. I think I especially enjoyed The Semi-Attached Couple, which is about a newly married couple who aren't quite getting on very well, and I just thought that was a really great novel. The next author I want to mention is Amelia B. Edwards. She was born in 1831 and died in 1892. She was a short story writer, a novelist, and a travel writer, and she was from London and moved in a lot of the kind of London literary circles. She published short stories in various literary magazines, including Dickens's 2 magazines, Household Words and All the Year Round. She was also an artist and sometimes illustrated her own writing, and she was also a keen archaeologist and Egyptologist, and wrote several books about archaeology and history, as well as 11 novels and lots of short stories. She also wrote a couple of poetry collections too, so very varied writer. I have read one short story by Amelia B. Edwards, The Phantom Coach from 1864, which I loved. That is probably her best known short story. It's a ghost story and it's really great, and that really makes me want to read more by her. So I think I need to give some other books by her a try. I'd be interested in reading Barbara's History from 1864, which is one of her better known novels and is one of many Victorian novels about bigamy. So, always an interesting plot point. Often in a sensation novel. I'm not sure if Barbara's History is a sensation novel or not. I've also heard mixed but potentially interesting things about her non-fiction travel book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. It's meant to be interesting, but also, of its time. So I might read that at some point, but I feel like that'll be one of those Victorian books I approach with academic interest rather than expecting to love it as a work of literature, if that makes sense. The next author I want to talk about is George Egerton. George Egerton is a pseudonym for Mary Shavaletta Dunbright, who was born in 1859 and died in 1945. So Georgia Egerton was actually born in Australia, but she spent her childhood in Ireland, and she then lived in a lot of countries over the course of her life. She lived in Germany, Norway, the US and Britain, but she always kind of considered herself Irish. She was a short story writer, a novelist and a playwright, and is another kind of key New Woman writer. I have read 2 of her collections of short stories, Keynotes from 1893 and Discords from 1894. These 2 are often published together, and they are great short stories. As always with short story collections, I think there were some short stories I loved more than others, but in general I really like her short fiction. I think it's great, really feminist, really interesting. I would like to read some more by George Egerton. She has another few collections of short stories, symphonies and fantasies, and then I'd be also interested to read her 1898 novel The Wheel of God, which is a partly autobiographical novel, so I think that'd be quite interesting. She also went on to write some plays in the 20th century, so I'd be kind of interested in reading some of them as well. And now we reach George Eliot, another really big significant writer during the Victorian period. So George Eliot was the pseudonym of Mary Ann Evans, who was born in 1819 and died in 1880. She's one of the most significant novelists from the Victorian period, and I think probably along with the Brontes, she would be the most famous female writer from the Victorian period. Her books were hugely well respected at the time, and she has gone on to have kind of a really massive, significant place within the canon. George Eliot started out as a literary critic and soon began to write fiction, and she had quite an interesting and unconventional life. She lived with George Henry Lewes, who was a fellow writer and journalist. We'll be talking about him later in the week. He was married to somebody else. They had separated after his wife had a child by somebody else. George Eliot and George Henry Lewes lived together unmarried for nearly 3 decades until his death, and a few years after his death, George Eliot married another man who was a friend of hers. George Eliot is known for her social critique novels and for her sort of careful psychological realism. And if you have watched my channel for any length of time, you will know that I am not a massive George Eliot fan. I do not love her books at all. I can respect her books a lot, and there is one book of hers that I am really fond of, but in general I do not get on with her writing style. When I have studied George Eliot at university, say, I have found things of interest to be said about her work, but when I'm actually reading her books, like as a reader, I just find her books very slow and very dry. And she always seems to focus on the characters I'm not interested in while neglecting the characters I want to hear about. I think it is very much the case of the wrong fit and me just not quite gelling with her writing style and her tone. You know, I've heard a lot of people say they find George Eliot very kind of wry and witty and very humorous, and I just have never found anything George Eliot wrote wry or witty or humorous at all. But you know, my sense of humour is like all Dickensian silliness, and there is nothing silly about George Eliot. I think a lot of my struggles with George Eliot kind of comes down to a lot of the same reasons why, when it comes to modern fiction, I prefer commercial and reading group fiction to literary fiction. Like, I think George Eliot's just a bit too literary and serious for me. However, I do think her books are worth reading, and a lot of people love her books a lot more than I do. I have read 5 of her novels, so I have given her a try. I really liked Daniel Deronda. That's definitely my favourite of her books, probably the only of her books that I would say I actually sort of actively like, and I do think it's really good and really worth a read. I respect Middlemarch a lot. I can see why it's really important. I find it very interesting. I don't know that I love it. I wouldn't recommend starting with it. I know it's her most famous, but it is quite long. It takes quite a long time to get into the story. You sort of spend a long time with one character before all the other characters are introduced. Then I would probably place Silas Marner in the middle. Now, I read Silas Marner as a teenager, and I don't remember it very well at all, but I have heard a lot of people who like George Eliot a lot more than I do and understand George Eliot a lot more than I do say that Silas Marner is a great place to start with her books. So I would probably recommend starting with Silas Marner. Then I would put in 4th place Adam Bede, which I didn't hugely get on with, and in last place, I would put The Mill and the Floss, which is my least favourite book ever, probably. I despise Mill and the Floss with my soul. I wouldn't recommend starting George Eliot with The Mill and the Floss because I think it is really controversial. I think a lot of people will hate and do hate the ending. I have read 5 out of George Eliot's 7 novels, so the 2 I haven't read are Romola and Felix Holt the Radical. I don't know whether I ever will read them because, as I said, I sort of know that I don't really get on with George Eliot. I am curious to try her gothic short story / novella, The Lifted Veil, because I hear that's quite different. But if I still don't like The Lifted Veil, then that will just confirm my general feeling that she's not for me. But she might be for you, so do please give her a try. As I said, the people who love George Eliot tell me that Silas Marner is the place to start with her books. And I would also maybe say that Daniel Deronda isn't a terrible place to start with her books. The next author I want to mention is Emily Faithfull. She was born in 1835 and died in 1895. And she is another one of those Victorian authors who just had a really fascinating life. She was from Surrey, and she was a women's rights activist and writer who was part of the Langdon Place Circle, which was a group that advocated for legal reform to improve women's rights and lives and places in society. And she was especially interested in advancing women's careers and chances of employment. She was involved in the Society for Promoting the Employment of Women, and she also established a printing press in London, specifically for women, called the Victoria Press. I think she's a really interesting feminist Victorian figure because she's quite a lot like earlier in the Victorian period than a lot of the other kind of notable feminist Victorian writers, a lot of whom were writing in the kind of 1880s, 1890s, and she was kind of active as a social reformer in the kind of 1850s and 1860s, which is really interesting. As far as historians can judge, Emily Faithfull was probably gay, and she was actually quite a key figure in a famous Victorian divorce trial that took place in 1864. So one of the reasons why I'm really interested in Emily Faithfull is because I've read quite a lot about this divorce trial, the Codrington divorce case. So in this trial, Henry Codrington was trying to divorce his wife, Helen, and it was very, very heavily implied throughout the divorce case that Helen Codrington and Emily Faithfull were lovers. Faithfull also accused Henry Codrington of trying to sexually assault her, and after this trial, Emily Faithfull's reputation was really damaged, and a lot of her sort of social reformer friends no longer wanted to be associated with her. She wrote one novel, Change Upon Change, a love story, from 1868, which is sometimes also published as A Reed Shaken with the Wind. I really want to read it, mostly because I find her a really fascinating figure, and I just feel like from what I know of her life, it's going to have a lot of feminist themes. Also, like, tangentially related to this, she is the protagonist of an Emma Donoghue novel from 2008, The Sealed Letter, so I really want to read that at some point too. The next author I want to mention is Millicent Garrett Fawcett. She was born in 1847 and died in 1929, and she was another feminist writer and activist, a champion of women's suffrage. In fact, she led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies from 1897 to 1919. So she was a suffragist rather than a suffragette, so part of the kind of less radical, less militant wing of the women's suffrage movement. And she was also married to Henry Fawcett, who was a Liberal MP and who was also interested in women's rights. So Millicent Garrett Fawcett mostly wrote non-fiction, often about political economy and women's history, kind of significant women throughout history, and she wrote lots of political non-fiction too, but she did write one novel and one short story collection. So I'm quite interested to read her short story collection, Tales of Political Economy, from 1847, where she tried to explain political economy through short stories. I'm not sure how successful that would have been, but I'm kind of fascinated. And then I also want to read her novel Janet Doncaster, which is about a young woman's struggle for independence and sounds really interesting. The next author I want to talk about is Michael Field. Now, Michael Field is in fact the pen name for two women, Catherine Harris Bradley and Edith Emma Cooper. So Catherine was born in 1846 and died in 1914, and Edith, who was her niece, was born in 1862 and died in 1913. So this aunt and niece pair wrote under the pen name Michael Field together. They wrote about 40 works of literature together, chiefly plays in verse, and they also wrote a long journal called Works and Days. They lived together throughout their life, and we are like pretty much 100% certain that they were lovers. Yes, they were an aunt and niece. They were also an incestuous couple. They were also part of the aesthetic movement. They were friends with Oscar Wilde, Vernon Lee, Rudyard Kipling, a lot of other authors, and they wrote a lot together. So they wrote a lot of love poems to each other, and as I said, a lot of plays in verse. They tried to keep their pen name Michael Field a secret, but they confided it to Robert Browning, and then he apparently told everyone. So people ended up knowing that they were Michael Field. I would be quite interested to read some of their plays in verse. I think they wrote like 25 plays in verse, so I have no idea where to start. But I'd also be kind of interested to read the journal that they wrote, Works and Days, which wasn't published until after their deaths, but was largely written during the Victorian period, and I think would be quite an interesting read. The next writer I want to mention is Isabella Ford. She was born in 1855 and died in 1924, and she was a writer and a suffragist from Yorkshire, another key feminist figure of the Victorian period. We've got a lot of great feminist writers today. Isabella Ford came from quite a politically radical family. Her parents were very politically active, and so was she. She was involved in the trade union movement, in the Independent Labour Party, in campaigning for animal rights and women's suffrage. She was a vegetarian at a time when it was very rare to be a vegetarian, and later during the First World War she was also involved in the pacifist movement. She wrote a few novels and also some non-fiction books. So the book by her I'm most keen to read is On the Threshold from 1895, which is apparently a novel influenced both by the sort of New Woman movement and the New Life socialism movement, about two students living together in London. Anna-Marie from Actual Spinster was talking about this book recently, and it just sounded really, really interesting, so I'm very keen to read that one. The next author I want to mention is Andrew Forrester. This is the pen name of James Redding Ware, and he was born in 1832 and died in 1909. He was a novelist, a journalist, and a playwright from London, and he's best known for creating one of the first female detective figures in fiction. He was also a Freemason, and he wrote both under his real name and under the pen name Andrew Forrester. I thought I would categorise him under Andrew Forrester, as the only book by him I've read is published under the name Andrew Forrester, and that is The Female Detective from 1864, which is a really interesting collection of short stories about a female detective. I enjoyed this. I don't think they're kind of the greatest detective stories ever, but they were really interesting. interesting, and I am curious to read more by him. I'd be quite interested to read his historical novel, The Fortunes of the House of Pennil, A Romance of England in the Last Century. I think one of the main reasons I quite like to read this is because it was illustrated by Halbert Knight Brown, also known as Fizz, who illustrated all of Dickens's novels, and I just think that's kind of fun. The next author I want to mention is Edith Henrietta Fowler. She was born in Wolverhampton in 1865 and died in 1944, and she wrote both for younger and older readers. I have read one book by her, The Young Pretenders, from 1895, which is a delightful children's book that is mostly like just fun and silly, but also has one serious strain that works really well. It's about these two little children who are being looked after by their aunt and uncle while their parents are away abroad, and it's all about kind of the creative, imaginative games that they play and about the kind of bond between uncle and niece, and it's just absolutely lovely. I would love to read some more by Edith Henrietta Fowler because I love this book so much. I think probably next on my list is her novel The Professor's Children from 1897, which is another book for children. The next author I want to mention is Lady Georgiana Fullerton, who was born in 1812 and died in 1885. She was a novelist and non-fiction writer from Staffordshire. She was born into an Anglican family, although she later converted to Catholicism, and Catholicism and religion more broadly is a theme of a number of her books. She published several novels and biographies, often of saints and religious figures, and she was also very involved in charitable works, including in the founding of a school. I have heard very good things about her novel Ellen Middleton from 1844, which is a novel about a woman who carries a guilty secret, and it sounds like it's a kind of like, I guess, a proto-sensation novel, like it's a sensation novel from before the age of sensation novels. Like sensation novels were really like a kind of 1860s, 1870s phenomenon, but it sounds like Ellen Middleton is a kind of early version of a sensation novel, and as someone who's kind of interested in like literary history and how genres develop, like that makes me even more excited to read Ellen Middleton, so I definitely need to get to that sometime. And then finally, let's talk about the wonder that is Elizabeth Gaskell. I have a lot of Elizabeth Gaskell books. I can't hold them all up all the time. So Elizabeth Gaskell was born in 1810 and died in 1865. She was born in London, but she grew up in Cheshire and spent a lot of her life in Manchester and the kind of surrounding area. So she writes a lot in her books about the north of England as well as about the south. She wrote several novels and also a lot of shorter works, and her themes and genres are really varied, which is one of many, many, many reasons why I love Elizabeth Gaskell. She wrote industrial novels, social critique novels, mysteries, comedies, gothic stories, domestic realism. She writes about the country, she writes about the city and small towns. She writes about love and family and grief and crime and so much more. I think she is one of the most versatile authors of the Victorian period and also one of the most talented. She also wrote non-fiction, most notably her Life of Charlotte Bronte from 1857. She was a close friend of Charlotte Bronte's, and after her death she wrote a biography of her. It isn't a very like conventional biography. Victorian biographies often consisted of like a lot of letters and other sources, so I would say that it's sort of like half biography and half collection of letters, and it's not that accessible, so don't start with The Life of Charlotte Bronte. It's really interesting, but start with her novels. Elizabeth Gaskell moved in a lot of literary circles. As I said, she was a friend of Charlotte Bronte. She also knew Dickens quite well, and he encouraged her writing. And she also knew Harriet Martineau, John Ruskin, and many more. Elizabeth Gaskell is a really, really fantastic author. So my favourite three Victorian authors are Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Anthony Trollope. She is right at the top for me. She is absolutely fantastic, so talented, so wonderful. Cannot recommend her books enough. She is so, so amazing. I've read a lot of Gaskell. I feel like Gaskell and Jane Austen are the two authors who I've read the most by in terms of like the proportion of their work I have read. Like I have read nearly everything that can be read by Elizabeth Gaskell. I've read all her novels, I've read her novellas, I've read a lot of her short stories. I think there are a few more short stories by her that I haven't read. Every now and then I think I've got through all her shorter fiction and I come across a short story I haven't read before, but I have read a lot and I love her books so very much. So her five major novels in no particular order are Mary Barton, North and South, Ruth, Sylvia's Lovers, and Wives and Daughters. And then she also wrote a lot of like short novels and novellas, and where the line is between a short novel and a novella and a really long short story is kind of varied. So there's Cranford, there's My Lady Ludlow, there's A Dark Night's Work, there's The Morland Cottage, there's Miss Harrison's Confessions, Lois the Witch, Cousin Phyllis, The Grey Woman, The Poor Clare, so many amazing shorter works. And she also has a few short story collections. There's The Grey Woman and Other Tales and Round the Sofa, and some of the novellas and long short stories that I just mentioned are in some of these short story collections. In general, I have just loved absolutely everything I've ever read by Elizabeth Gaskell. Like, there's not a single thing I've ever read by her that I didn't love. I think she is fantastic. My absolute favourite books by Elizabeth Gaskell would be North and South and Wives and Daughters, which are two of my absolute favourite books of all time, like top 10, if not top 5. I mean, there's not really space in my top 5 for all the books that go in my top 5, if you know what I mean, but like, they're right at the top. I love them so much, for so many different reasons. They are amazing. Wives and Daughters is very slightly unfinished, which I think is worth being aware of. Gaskell died when she had maybe like 2 more chapters left to write. Because she was so near the end, it's not unsatisfying, but it does mean that maybe it's not the best place to start with her books. I would say that North and South is a great place to start with Elizabeth Gaskell. It's really accessible. It's got a great love story and a lot of social criticism. It's a wonderful, wonderful industrial novel. But also you could start with some of her shorter works. A Dark Night's Work is a great novella that is really rich and dramatic. Penguin Classics have an edition called Gothic Tales, with a lot of her shorter works that are on the more kind of gothic ghostly side, and some of them are really great to start with. I would probably recommend not to start with Cranford, because although I love it a lot and it's very funny, it is quite episodic and doesn't have much of a plot, so it can be more of an acquired taste, and some people find it a bit harder to get into. And I would also say possibly don't start with Sylvia's Lovers, because there's quite a lot of heavy dialect in it, which can make it a bit less accessible. Elizabeth Gaskell is one of those authors where, as I said, she's really versatile and really varied. So if you've read one Elizabeth Gaskell book or 2 Elizabeth Gaskell books and you didn't like them, that doesn't mean you don't like Elizabeth Gaskell. Like, you kind of have to read all of her books to find the right ones for you. If you're a fan of Thomas Hardy, you will love Sylvia's Lovers and Ruth. But if you're a fan of Dickens, then you'll love North and South. If you're a fan of Jane Austen, then you'll love Wives and Daughters, and probably also North and South. If you're a fan of the Brontes, then you should read her Gothic Tales. I just kind of think there's a Gaskell for everyone, and I love her so much. She is the best. I have done other videos on Elizabeth Gaskell. I've done individual book reviews of all her novels and a lot of her novellas, so I'll leave them down below. And I've also done a video with tips for reading Elizabeth Gaskell, so I will leave that link down below as well. But in general, I do think she is truly amazing. So those are all the authors that I wanted to tell you about today. Please do come by tomorrow, where we're going to be talking about authors from George Gissing to Geraldine Dewsbury and many in between. Tomorrow we've got comic writers like George and Whedon Grossmith and Jerome K. Jerome. We've got amazing feminist writers like Sarah Grand. We've got Thomas Hardy coming up tomorrow. We've got amazing poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins and A.E. Housman. And there's just a lot of exciting people to be talking about tomorrow. So that's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this long, lengthy discussion of many amazing Victorian writers. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these writers and what you thought of them. And I'll be back tomorrow with another bookish video.